Hello, good evening. Welcome, Tanse, everyone, to this evening's ECAMPing trip, the very first ECAMPing trip where we will be talking about aspects of Edmonton's Asian history. And it is only going to be aspects because with over 40 countries making up Asia, there's no way that we can tell all of those stories about all of those folks who have come and made Edmonton home and who are part of our history. So we're just going to be talking about a few aspects tonight. My name is Christina Hardie, and I am the curator of the Edmonton City as Museum project, fondly known as ECAMP, which is an initiative of the Edmonton Heritage Council. I am going to be your host for the evening, but we have a few pieces of housekeeping before we get started. So first, our opening music was by local Edmonton musician Jesse Northey. Please note that this event is being recorded and is being live streamed to Facebook. So hello everyone who's joining us via Facebook. Please note that we are recording tonight's event and a copy of the recording will be publicly available in time on the Edmonton City as Museum website. So if you want to revisit the teachings tonight, or if you want to share the event with someone who isn't able to be with us, you will be able to access that through the ECAMP website. A couple other pieces of housekeeping. So we do have the chat room available, and you can access it. There's a bar down at the bottom of your screen, so you can access the chat room. And there are two different ways that you can use the chat room. So the first way is that you can send a message to everybody who's attending and to all of the panelists. So it's a big open chat room. The second way that you can use it is you can use it to send a message just to myself or any of the panelists. So if something's going on with our video, if there's a problem and you need us to know right away, you can get a hold of us using the chat room. Please note that we will be taking a transcript of the chat. So just kind of knowing that before you type anything in there. And we also have someone who will be lurking in the background. And literally, if you look right there, she's right there. So that is Elise. She works at the Edmonton Heritage Council with myself. And Elise is going to be monitoring the chat room and helping out with some of the back end things. Something to keep in mind is that we at ECAMP have a zero tolerance policy for any type of swearing, hate, discrimination, any kind of meanness in our chat room. So you get one warning, but if it continues, Elise will be saying goodbye to you for the evening. But I hope we can have some really wonderful, supportive dialogue in our chat room. So here is our schedule for the evening. So after I kind of do our introduction, I'm going to introduce our first two speakers. And after they have spoken, we'll have a Q&A section. There is a Q&A feature down on the bottom. And I think you can start submitting your Q&A answers if you have them, if they pop up. But we will be addressing them at the end. After our first Q&A, we're going to have a little 5-minute stretch and sip break, move around a little bit. That's going to be about 7:30-ish, I'm hoping. And then afterwards, we'll have the members from the Aiya Collective come and talk about Chinatown development and redevelopment. We'll have a Q&A with those folks, a big Q&A with everybody, and then we're going to say goodnight. And we're hoping to wrap up by 8:30 today. And finally, before we get started, it's really important that I acknowledge the place in which I am living, the place where my historical work is rooted, and the place from where I'm broadcasting tonight is located on Indigenous land. Land that has been occupied and traveled and cared for by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. I want to acknowledge that I am located in Treaty 6 territory along Kaskasawani-Sipi, the North Saskatchewan River, in Edmonton, Alberta, also known as Amiskwacîwâskahikan. And amiskwacîwâskahikan, when translated from Cree into English, is Beaver Hills House. Amiskwacî are the Beaver Hills to the east of our city, in kind of the Elk Island, Miquelon area. And Waskahikan House is a reference to Fort Edmonton And kind of considering this name was kind of a little bit of an aha moment for myself, who, you know, I spend time thinking about this place, wanting to make sure that I'm using the right words. And for myself, I've always been kind of using amiskwacîwâskahikan with the understanding that it was like a pre-contact term. However, amiskwacîwâskahikan, that is a term for Fort Edmonton. And I guess I'm sharing a little bit of this story today, just because the names that we use carry story. And I think it's important that we know the meaning behind the words that we're using. So I acknowledge that this place, amiskwacîwâskahikan, is a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route of the Nehiwa, the Anishinaabe, the Nistastapi, the Métis, the Dene, and the Nakota Sioux. And I acknowledge these things not because it's politically correct or a checkbox requirement, but rather because a treaty acknowledgement is a necessary reminder of the history of this place. It is one of the many contextual grounding points when considering the history of this place. A treaty acknowledgement reminds us, and it reminds me, that we are a part of a collective history that we are still beholden to today. It serves to remind us that we, as individuals living in this place, we are all treaty people, and as such, we are beholden to the agreements made in that treaty. We are implicated in that treaty. However, this part of our collective history, these agreements between nations in which we are all implicated, have been historically excluded from the stories that we tell about this past, have been excluded from the stories that we tell about this place, and have been excluded from the stories that we tell about ourselves to ourselves. So it is necessary, as folks who have settled and whose families have settled this place, to not forget our obligations as treaty people, to not forget or exclude this part of our shared history, to not position it as something that happened in the past and something that is relevant only to the past. And most importantly, for those of us who are settlers, we must make sure that we are doing the necessary work to educate ourselves about the history of this place and to familiarize ourselves with the agreements, the promises that were made in Treaty 6, and especially from the Indigenous perspectives that have been historically silenced or misrepresented. We have to all recognize the ongoing legacy and impact of colonial violence against Indigenous peoples and how we have as settlers have benefited and continue to benefit from that violence. And I share this treaty acknowledgement not because I have to, but because these histories, these stories, these legacies are still relevant to us today. They're relevant to all of us living in this place today. And these histories, they must always be kept in mind and acknowledged, and most importantly, included when moving through our city and engaging with the stories of this place. So before we get started with our evening tonight, it must be acknowledged that we are living on occupied lands, that we are all implicated in the obligations of Treaty 6, and we are all treaty people. Hi. All right. So I am absolutely humbled and thankful to be joined by so many talented and knowledgeable and well-spoken women. And I would very much like to invite our first two speakers to turn on their videos and join us in the webinar. So we have Shreela Chakrabartty and Soni Dasmohaptra. Hi, welcome. Oh, and a note for folks who are watching. So you are able to adjust where you see the video panel. So you can drag it around the screen, make it long across the top, make it tiny across the side, and kind of reposition it however you'd like. All right. So Shreela Chakrabartty is the second generation daughter to 1960s waves immigrants from India. She was born and lives in Edmonton. Her career as a movie director began as a regular participant in her father's community building efforts with the documentation of Canadian life. Combined with world travel, Shreela has worked on Oscar-nominated movies with Deepa Mehta and currently partners with Cash Gawani on Shreela and Cash marquee features like Lakeshore Drive and their box office hit thriller Rock, Paper, Dice, Enter. Her current short story documentary, Punjabi Pioneers of Alberta, is funded in part by the TELUS Optic Story Hive and the Edmonton Heritage Council. Shreela continues her love for telling cavalier stories that raise awareness about her Canadian heritage and experience with history. And joining Shreela is Soni. So Soni Dasmohaptra is a passionate advocate for the promotion of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Throughout her diverse career, she has had the opportunity to be an educator, policy wonk, convener, and creative leader. She has a consulting practice in Edmonton, which you should ask her about, and she is a yogi who can offer womb blessings and other healing modalities. Soni spent 20 years in Toronto developing Canadian heritage materials for the Toronto District School Board, the City of Toronto, and community agencies involved in sharing and celebrating Black History and Asian Heritage Month. She was an organizer for Toronto's Masala Mendi Masti Festival, which celebrates Toronto's South Asian community annually. And since returning to Edmonton 5 years ago, Soni has developed and presented heritage content for Edmonton Public Schools, the Government of Alberta, and she was the interim grants coordinator at the Edmonton Heritage Council in 2009. So welcome, Soni and Shreela. I'm so thankful to have you both here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Christina.
Thanks, Christina. Namaste, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. I'm just going to share my screen right now and start it. We're so happy that we could have you here today. So today, Shreela and I will be presenting ECAMP Asian Heritage Month presentation that is actually looking at Asian history in Canada. So we're going to take you on an exciting journey of the grit of pioneers, the resilience of different communities, and sort of the exclusion that they face, but how that surpassed all of them, all of their struggles to move into a new space. And I would just like to start by reiterating some of what Christina said too. This history is Canadian history, is Edmonton's history, is everyone's history, right? When we talk about documenting history, who holds the pen, who holds the power, whose voices are heard and whose voices are not heard. Think about this critically while we move through this presentation. And the last thing is like to name exclusion, recognize it so that we can move towards inclusion, right? It's really important to have these sort of underlying pieces so that we can move into the next phase of what a future state can be. So we start our journey with Indigenous Peoples of Canada and Turtle Island. So from Indigenous worldview, Turtle Island is all of the Americas, Canada, US, and Mexico, and time in memoriam, as Christina has mentioned, Indigenous people have been here. They are actually multicultural, diverse, having different traditions, having different pieces that we all can learn from as well. So that's where we start our story of acknowledging this in Canada. Then we move into the colonization piece that Christina was mentioning as well. Here is an important intersection about understanding how colonization was a global piece of sort of power, economy, and politics that impacted many different nations. So in Canada, when the British colonized, there was a Hudson Bay Company established. And when it happened in India, the East India Company was established. So power and economics became a sort of piece that a lot of people have experienced in different ways. The British brought us governance systems and different forms of exclusion, different legislation. That is why we understand how we are today. And it's important to, I think, understand this as we move forward in history, because it talks a lot about how Canada became a nation. When we talk about Canada becoming a dominion in 1867, this is the same time that Treaty 6 was also signed. And so, as Christina has said, we are all treaty people. But what does it mean when we look at this history and we look at who has been included and who has been excluded? We'll go through that as we move into this whole presentation. So now the question, who is a South Asian? This is a very complex piece because before 1945, India was a large mass of land that spread through different trading routes and different peoples, all the way from Persia to China to Fiji. So it was like a really rich, robust trading and economy that was happening across sectorally in that region. And people were actually leaving India in different ways. When British colonization happened, for example, people who were hired as indentured labor were sent to Guyana and Trinidad and Jamaica, and they're known as West Indians. In the context of South Asia as well, we have all different religions: Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, Christian, Jews, Buddhists, Jains. So that's another piece of the complexity. And lastly, we also have every single notion of like every province is a different language, and secondary migration patterns of people who have come to Fiji, who have come to UK, who have come to Canada. So it's very convoluted. But the South Asian Canadian definition is people who are from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives, and secondary patterns as well. So it's very complex. So now I'm going to move on to Shreela to start her presentation.
Thanks, Soni. It's good to hear at this ECAMP. Everybody's see history through the eyes of everybody who's experienced it. But my story is, let me, if I can put us into play mode here. There we go. How's this? Can everybody see and hear me?
We sure can.
Oh, okay, great.
I think there was some feedback a little earlier on about needing to talk a little bit louder, but everything's looking good in the chat room.
Excellent. So not everybody has a migration experience, but we have to appreciate being on this treaty territory land because it is our history, and that's how we see how the old settlers and the Indigenous people came together. And now we can also appreciate how other migrants arrived here. One of the things that I found was that, you know, as human beings common to the earth, we all like to feel safe and connected. And that's where our brains feel settled. We can sleep at night. But in order to learn and grow, we have to put ourselves at risk and break out of our past, and we have to disrupt. So when the Punjabi pioneers came swashbuckling into Canada, this is what happened. Our heritage records show how they presented a threat to Edmontonians because they brought in different beliefs, different habits, languages, measurements of status, entitlements, different way of looking at wealth. They had a different ability to survive. But with it, they brought us a ticket to become better humans. I've had the pleasure of being the director on this short documentary by TELUS Optic Story Hive, looking at early pioneers from Asia originating from the region of Punjab prior to 1947. Our query began in this park, the Sohan Singh Buller Park in the Woods. Our team producer, Robin Yusuf, had a friend, Ranbir, who shared the same name as on the side. And indeed, he revealed that he is the great grandnephew of Sohan Singh Buller. But he didn't know much more about it. But in the course of making the film, he definitely grew an appreciation for what he learned about the experiences of pioneers. And in order to help him out, we kind of hit the wiki trail, and this is what we found out. So fact number one, the Earth, the continents on the Earth were much closer together And fact number 2, we can trace our genes back to the subcontinent of Africa. But our story begins with fact number 3, that Alberta incorporated in 1905. So what stands out here is that humans like to migrate. Soni shared the Turtle Island origin story, and then the trading company explorers came to do business in all different parts of the world in the mid-1600s. And it created a disruption. And that disruption also opened up this migration of people. And we continue to redefine our world with different kinds of hyphens and agreements. And but the template so far has been West European, primarily British. Our province, for example, is named after the 4th daughter of Queen Victoria. So from the Park and Mill Woods, named Sohan Singh Buller, I want to take us to another photo dated 1903. These guys. So in the once bustling village of Frank, Alberta, this is a village that got abandoned because of a natural disaster, but that natural disaster gave us the date 1903. So we knew, for the fortune had it, that an employee of the Canadian Pacific Railway Company took photographs of people containing Asian Indians, and they stand out by their turbans. But one of the things I thought while looking at this was that, hey, wait a minute, people all the way from Africa to Asia wear turbans. So are these people from Punjab? So in our records, we tried to focus on the region of Punjab mainly because of the last name Singh. It shows up more frequently in historical records. And Singh is the Sikh cultural group originating in Punjab, but in the records, they're referred to as East Indians and Hindu. And the men in this photo, they don't look like tourists, but there were different kinds of travelers from India in those days. For example, in 1893, there was a ship full of passengers traveling to the Chicago World Fair. And among them was Jamsetji Nusarwanji Tata. Now, he was traveling looking for business ideas. And today you might recognize that name on tea box labels or Tata Steel Canada, and even as the global digital ecosystem enabler. There's also Swami Vivekananda. He was also on that ship. He was a Hindu monk from Bengal on his way to attend the Parliament of World Religions. So notice they're both wearing turbans, but neither of them are from Punjab, and neither of them settled in the West. I also found that in 1897, Queen Victoria was celebrating her Diamond Jubilee, and she had amongst her, during the year that she was celebrating, there were Sikh soldiers in her army regiments that toured through Canada. This is in 1897. So this early travel, people were seeing what Canada looked like. There was a lot of international advertisements on trains and ships that sparked the impetus of 5,000 Punjabi entrepreneurs to settle Canada's West by 1907. So the reality is that prior to 1905, Punjabi migrants were settling here with humble beginnings on farms and logging forests. They were not of European origin, and by virtue of their work and petitions, they have contributed significantly to the fabric of a nation. So I think we have a case here that they should definitely be included in the history of pioneers, and everybody in Canada should know about them. And so we'll probably get more into this later, but whatever gossip, racism, restriction policies, and bad publicity that got sensational coverage in the media of the day doesn't take away anything from their tenacity, hard work, their trials, and their tribulations. Their contributions led us to the privileges we enjoy today, such as permanent residency, citizenship, legal, voting, minority, and even labor rights. And close to the heels of globetrotting men were pioneer women. There's a story that I always love to tell, which is Edmonton's youngest female city councillor, Margaret Crang. She had a friendship with this Indian social reformer and freedom activist, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. Kamala Devi was a watchdog for Mahatma Gandhi leading up to India's independence. And she was a delegate at an international peace congress where she met Margaret. And Margaret, as a lawyer, helped the local Punjabi community here make the legal case for undocumented Asians to get Canadian citizenship before things got messy, leading to the War of Independence in India. Canada has always had a positive presence on the world stage, so it's really inspiring to know Edmonton's role in establishing Asian settlements in Canada. And that behind this effort, there were some very strong women. But I have to confess, I am not Punjabi. I came into this picture in 1969 with different cross-cultural experiences. I've been unpacking this human complexity by studying my heritage history, traveling, and browsing through records. I've been settled in Alberta for over half a century, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to my parents' families that I have to, I think, mention to give you some kind of a context of where I'm coming from and how come I'm telling a Punjabi story. My mom's family owned the territory where Kolkata, India is situated before the arrival of the British. In fact, in 2003, they overturned in the city's high court the historical claim that Job Charnock of the East India Company was its founder, and the family is still living there to this day. My dad's family, on the other hand, his family made the first big leap out of their state of Bengal, which became East Pakistan in 1942 and then Bangladesh in 1971. So when our family started to migrate out of this region, I called it the big leap. And so it always leads me to wonder what will be our next leap as Canadians. And so, so to get there, I think, is a journey to get past our biases. So mine, like so many of us, are fitted with a colonial European lens. I'm guilty of it all the time. I see this when I look at my own Asian heritage. And especially working with my diverse documentary team, it was really important for me to remind myself of this bias. So my mechanism while researching early pioneers from Punjab, I would always label every record as image, story, documents as being colonial. And then I would have this unconscious bias of Bengali. And then I'd look at the same thing again in a more universal and inclusive way. And I found that to be pretty helpful. And it allowed me to look at Punjabiness in Edmonton's culture without necessarily putting on Punjabi shades. So, and I did this because I wanted to see if I could see what the city naming committee was recognizing when it named Sohan Singh Bullard Park. When you see the documentary, this will become important, but I'm not going to give anything away right now. Experiences of heritage by first generations born in Edmonton are often stereotyped as confused, white on the inside, because our heritage practices come to us, they're inherited outside of its original place and context, right? We learn our language off migrated parents, off of the TV, cereal boxes, we take classes. We learn about customs through our communities, school, travel, food, philosophies. But magically, everything somehow filters through but it's not intuitive. Like, and some of these colonial words and terms that we drop are not intuitive. I think that if I hadn't gone to university or traveled, I'd have a much harder time figuring out all these associations of Asians, Indians, Native Indians, East, West, South Asians. Soni described for us what a South Asian is, but no one I speak to identifies as a South Asian, East Indian, or even Asian, except when you're trying to fill out a census form. These terms are imposed, and I think in it there's a bias that gets embedded in our systems. But meanwhile, I'm really happy to be exposed to Punjabi and all diverse cultures of India and Asia through contact and intermingling growing up in Edmonton and in Canada. These are the terms I was talking about. They made it really hard to find records of our history. We take it for granted that heritage records are public, but who tells you that that they also come from private donations of personal records? We sort of take it for granted that a family member will be stewards of our heirlooms. But what happens if they move or these records get destroyed? Many of our communities have very little idea of, or they don't have the capacity to preserve history in the making. How will people decades from now access information needed to learn about our experiences? I mean, is it all going to be on social media? So as we approach the end of paper records altogether, I think it's really important to gather this information now while we still have these things, in order for the future generations to understand the experiences we're living through now. And this is really telling. I discovered this the most when looking at the Punjabi heritage, because most of the history is buried. It's undocumented, it's informal, lots of oral accounts. And inside of it, one of the pieces I had trouble with was women's history. I scoured to find anything about women's history. In Edmonton, we couldn't find a single woman pioneer. The two earliest wives we found were African American, and that opened up a whole other rabbit hole of discovery of religious conversions, commingling amongst minority groups. But these are the names that did come up. Punjabi pioneers, they're a spirited group. They got recognized as prominent people in city papers and the University of Alberta Gateway campus newspaper, even on CKUA radio. There are more people in the documentary that we kind of spend some time with. And I am getting pretty excited to share it with you, but I just wanted to show you a few of the names that we found. And they all worked in lumber and agricultural industries in some capacity to survive, but they had such grand visions, and thankfully some of them even wrote about their experiences. And these men, by traveling outside of their homelands, I think they discovered a world, ways of the world, law and order. Darshan Singh, he discovered communism at UBC. And for that reason, you know, it's like we have improvements in our human, civil, and labor rights. So I encourage you to follow our journey on Facebook, and there's still thousands of stories that are untold, and so please share your story with us. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Michael Howley at Mount Royal University in Calgary, because he started the Alberta Sikh History Project and is now building a website and is including Northern Alberta. So we look forward to seeing more on that front. But what I have to say is it's so important for you to visit the archives, befriend an archivist, and donate your private records. Keep the preservation of art history in your community's agenda. So with that, I turn it back to Soni to take us through the rest of the timeline of Canadian immigration and policy history to see where we've landed in terms of inclusiveness and how we can get to that next great leap. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreela. So coming back to where we left off, moving forward, I think it's important now to examine the time that we're in. So from 1905 to about 1950, I'm going to go through the history of Asian arrivals and restrictive Canadian immigration policies that changed the landscape of how people were included within the Canadian context and Edmonton as well. And despite the grit and tenacity and hard work of these pioneers, there are lots of other people who are excluded from this Canadian story. So South Asian Canadians, as Shreela mentioned, have been here for a very long time. Here's an article from the Edmonton Journal dated December 9th, 1938. So as many of you know, the Al Rashid Mosque was the first mosque to be built in Canada, and it was in Edmonton. And the opening of the mosque was actually held by a Muslim scholar, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, who was an Indian statesman. So it's very exciting to see this represented. Chinese Canadians, which Grace and Lan will speak about after, arrived in Canada in 1880 to work on the Canadian Railroad. They set up many businesses, and there were Chinatowns in Edmonton, Red Deer, and Calgary as early as the early 1900s and late 1800s. Here are some pictures of Chinese Albertans in High River, in Lacombe, in Calais, Alberta, Chinese women. And this all came with a price because of the way immigration was set in Canada. Chinese head tax was set to actually prohibit immigrants from the Chinese community to come and settle. Whereas a European migrant had to pay $5, a Chinese migrant had to pay $25 head tax. So there was this discrepancy, this inequity that was starting to build. Due to this, a lot of Chinese women could not come with families, so a lot of men had just come and settled here. So that piece about Shreela's piece about looking for women pioneers of Chinese or Asian descent is very difficult because of this restrictive policy. There was also the Gentleman's Agreement in 1908, which restricted Japanese people also from establishing families and communities in Canada. And let us not forget the Japanese internment camps in 1945, after or around that time with the World War II. In fact, David Suzuki was part of that as well. Now let's talk about continuous journey legislation. This is the biggest legislation that actually prohibited a lot of South Asians from coming to settle in Canada. And this continuous journey legislation has actually been made into a film by Ali Kazemi, who's an excellent filmmaker based out of Toronto. I highly recommend that you watch this film. I've sent this resource document to Christina to include. Ali Kazemi did a lot of research, and one of the biggest things that he found was sort of the ambiance of Western Canada in the early 1900s. The biggest barroom ballad in 1914 was White Canada Forever. And he has showed it in this film as an archival piece that has come from the Canadian archives. So it's really good to see it because you can see what this piece is. Anti-Asian riots. There were a lot of fear-mongering among Asians taking over sort of Western Canada. So this particular legislation blocked Indian people from coming, and it's a really ridiculous legislation. It came all the way saying that if you came from India and you left a port, you could not stop anywhere, not gather food or not have fuel, anything. You had to make a straight continuous journey and arrive either at Halifax or Vancouver, which seemed impossible at the time because you have to stop. However, the Kamarga defied this and did land on Vancouver shores. And the irony is that it landed at a time when Queen Victoria's birthday was being celebrated. So the Sikhs who had come as part of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, as Shreela mentioned, were the same Sikhs who were not allowed to disembark from the ship. The ship was in Vancouver's port. They were there for 2 months. Only 24 were allowed to disembark. There were 340 Sikhs, 24 Muslims, and 12 Hindus. And remember, they were all British subjects because India was also a British colonial power. So they weren't even allowed to vote. A lot of people passed away on the boat. When they returned to India, a lot of people were very disappointed, but this is a really big deal about how immigration was prohibited. So when we look at the changes in Canada that happened following this, in the 1950s, there was a bit of an uplifting because immigration started becoming a little bit more open due to the fact that human rights and other tools were coming into Canada's psyche, and the war had just finished, so people were trying to see how to be more expansive. But when we talk about this other piece about the right to vote, white women got the right to vote in 1917. People of color could not vote until 1950, and Aboriginal peoples, Indigenous peoples could not vote until the late 60s. There's an excellent film as well by the BC Sikh Heritage Museum on disenfranchisement, which follows all of the advocacy that was used by Sikhs, by Chinese, by all Asian communities and other communities as well, Indigenous, to try to bring forward the vote. And I highly recommend you also watch this. I give Christina the link. So now that everybody had the right to vote in 1953, let's take a snapshot of Canada's population. According to 1950s data, there were 37,145 immigrants from Asiatic countries. 97% of the population was of European origin. So this is a really stark difference to imagine that if these immigration policies were not so restrictive, were not prohibitive, were not exclusionary, what would Canada's demographic look like at this point, right? So I think it's important to, like I said in the beginning, name exclusion, understand where it's brought us, so that we can move towards more inclusive policies. The White Paper on Immigration in 1966 opened up a different flight of immigrants to come because it was more based on a point system, more based on labor and what the needs of Canada were. So now when we move into this era of the timeline, I want to talk about how the South Asian community grew in Edmonton. So in 1967, you will see a group of women from Kerala, nurses had come with this new immigration policy. Nurses like Mary Thomas from Kerala, who were Christian, ended up coming because Alberta had a shortage of nurses, so they were able to contribute successfully to Edmonton's economy at this point. This is a picture of breaking the ground for the Waiji Hindu temple in the Lahin multicultural village that also has a Sikh Gurdwara, or a Sikh temple, a Ukrainian place of worship, and an Italian center as well. This is MLA Horst Schmidt, who was the founder of Canadian Heritage Days as well. And he's actually breaking the ground for this temple, which is really exciting to see. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms came up in 1982, so we see more progressive ways of people to actually be accessing legal means to sort of defend their rights and freedoms. In 1980, we see the startings of media. So South Asians took over CKR and started interview radio programming. There's a whole list of South Asian-owned businesses that started emerging. Canada's Multiculturalism Act came into effect in 1988. So let's talk about diversity and multiculturalism. It's a great thing. It's amazing, you know, like how we said the Indigenous population first, when they Chan-Marples, so diverse, so we can actually learn from them. But diversity and multiculturalism is not enough. There has to be a movement towards recognizing inclusion so that we can look at towards how we can be more inclusive, right? How do you create spaces for inclusion? This is what I want to leave you with for this. In 1990, there was the India Day celebrations in the Jubilee Auditorium. This is a picture of me dancing back in the day. And then, of course, Little India on 34th Ave, which has become such an iconic YEG space, right? You can go get a samosa, get some saris, get some bangles, have some fun. It's really great. And let us not forget that in 2016, Justin Trudeau did apologize for the Kamagatumaru incident and has recognized it as a piece of shame in Canadian history. Just recently, the former Premier Rachel Notley also posted about 2 weeks ago saying, don't forget this. This is racism. Let's remember this so we don't do the same mistakes moving forward. But also let's remember that when Justin Trudeau apologized in 2019, there's all this footage that came out of him in blackface, in brownface, and it was really scandalous. So it's a really complex and hurtful issue, and systemic and individual racism are still in our fabric and in the ways that we work. So how do we move towards more inclusive practice and creating spaces for inclusion while recognizing this. And why Asian Heritage Month? So you know what, like I said in the beginning, this month shouldn't be a month. It should be for everyone, right? Like every day should be Asian history, every day should be Black history, every day should be European history. It's important, right? But let's talk about why it's important to have this month, despite the fact that there isn't much. So Shreela just shared this amazing story of Punjabi pioneers. It's a hidden history. It's not documented. It's not talked about. How many people of color know what histories have been in different parts of Canada and have talked about it? We live in a very Eurocentric curriculum society where we learn about European conquest, which is important, but we don't know about anything else. In 2000, Senator Vivian Poy, at that time, declared May as Asian Heritage Month, and it became a federal sort of piece. So it's not all about history, it's about where we are today and how we go moving forward. There was a lot of advocacy that was done by different communities of Asian origin to have this month, so people could recognize that this Asian contribution and Asian history has to be recorded and documented in ways that will sort of shift this understanding that we are always newcomers. We are peripheral newcomers. Asian peoples, Asian source of countries, Filipinos, Chinese, Indian, Pakistanis, we are not peripheral newcomers. We've been here for 100 years or more, right? And why is it important to have this? So I'd like to share a personal story before I sign off. My son's in grade 4, when he was in grade 4, the Alberta curriculum, the social studies curriculum was on Alberta history. His teacher at EPSB asked me to come and do a similar presentation about the history of different communities in Asia. When I got to the classroom, I was shocked. They were reading American civil rights heroes, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Rosa Parks. They had one story about Bill Desmond, but it was really not the same impact, right? I was shocked. I'm like, why are they learning this in Alberta history? Why are they not learning about these heroes that we've spoken about, or about Indigenous heroes, or about different spaces? So for me, it's like we need to have this in curriculum. This needs to be part of core understanding, whether it be elementary, middle school, high school, or university, because this is how we shift to understand how we can be more inclusive as overall. So what is the next great leap that Shreela and I are talking about? So first, as Christina mentioned, Shreela mentioned, through reconciliation and relationships with Indigenous peoples, how do we work in relation with Indigenous peoples to create a brighter future, to create a more inclusive future? And how is it that we take the torch and move away from the typical narrative that is shared and allow for space of voices less heard, so that everybody's history, everybody's experiences, and everybody's documentation of what is heritage is encompassed in a way that is equitable, leading to equality. Thank you so much. So Christina, we're done?
Put it out there that if you do have any question and answers, please send it our way. A question I had while we might wait for folks is that you both grew up in Edmonton. Could you speak a little bit about how you understood, I guess, the master narrative of Edmonton, and where you saw yourself or you didn't see yourself, and like how did that make your heart feel? You talked about your son, Soni, but you were that little girl at one point too.
So I think that growing up in Edmonton was interesting because you always had to negotiate for myself, because actually Shreela and I have known each other since birth. Well, I've known her since I've been born because we're both from the Big community, and it's interesting that we both ended up doing this work that we're so passionate about, and we reconnected after a very long time. So one thing that I can say about growing up in Edmonton, like Shreela said, is there are so many interesting ways that the Bengali community, without intentionally doing so, created social justice activists like myself because there was an opportunity, an avenue to sort of like have this option of like, oh, I can go to this community hall, i.e. Pleasant View, take part in the 10-day goddess ceremony that is huge in India, and feel like I have a sense of belonging and a sense of identity and a sense of strength. So that when I do go back to like mainstream Edmonton that is predominantly white, that doesn't understand me sometimes, that is not conducive to the way that I feel I can belong or fit in, I had the strength to sort of push that, right? So, but at the same token, I had a really good experience with different people. But what is the biggest thing that I wanted to share coming back to Edmonton after spending so much time in Toronto is that I forgot about what it means to be Albertan. You know, like pull up your bootstraps, work hard, like oil and gas, the big pickup trucks, like all these iconic Albertan things. I'm like, oh, I forgot. But it's part of our heritage. So how do we reconcile that and move forward to a better future for my children and for myself as well? Shreela?
Yeah. See, I had a different experience. I saw it more as flying by the seat of your pants. That's just how we operate here in Edmonton. If you want to see something happen, you do it yourself. You create things. You insert yourself into stories. You meet different characters. You meet people. It's a small town. It has a small town mentality, even though it's a city. So it's not difficult to meet with your neighbors or interact with people, find out about other people's histories. And so even though there is this larger narrative or there is this formal exclusion that takes place, but on a grassroots level, you're still intermingling. You're still, sharing your recipes. You're still, like the culture, I find, has a way of magically coming through no matter what your differences are. And it's amazing.
Thank you. We have one question that's come through our Q&A from Kate Gunn. Thank you so much. We're going to answer it live. So the question is, from the communities you are a part of and that you're documenting, shared, and highlighting, how are the stories of today's women being documented, shared, and highlighted?
So I can share a story about that. So last year in 2019, there was a collective that was started, South Asian Women in Motion. It was actually led by Rabia, who brought together a group of diverse South Asian women to actually host a leadership conference over 3 sessions and then a larger one that happened last year. So as part of this, there were a whole bunch of women who got together, talked about their challenges, their successes, and sort of documented how they wanted to move forward. And this project was actually funded by Status of Women, former Status of Women Alberta. So that was a really great space to be part of and see how things have changed now and things are moving forward now. So that's one way of sort of that piece being documented for sure.
And one thing you'll notice now is a lot of organizations are being led by women. You see women on the executive organizing committees. They've always sort of been there doing that, but now they will be the ones who will organize the collection of records. I see across communities. From in 2015, I actually outreached to all of the South Asian communities, talking about their history and records. And that's why I keep harping on that. People point to me and go, archives. Okay, I remember to go visit the archives. But I think it's starting to, people are starting to understand how important it is to keep records and donate it to the collective.
And donating those records are so critical to future historical work. I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that at the archives, we keep everything. We have everyone's stories, we have everyone's perspectives, but there's a bias that exists within the types of things that are accepted into the archives. So when we look back 100 years ago, who were the people making donations and what perspectives and voices did they tell? And although there were many South Asian and Punjabi people here, those weren't the records that were being kept. And so it's the hard work that needs to be, or not as many, I'd say. So it's the hard work that needs to be done now for the future.
It's so good you say that. One of the messages I got from the community too on that was that it's a trust building relationship you have to have with public institutions, and that level of trust has not been established yet. Nobody feels like they can trust putting their records into a public institution for the same reasons that, you know, if your funding gets cut and your department is gone, then all our records have suddenly disappeared with it. So this is something really serious to consider, that all these community groups, they need to have people who are constantly engaging in this type of negotiation to build that trust, because we have to sooner or later arrive at another treaty, right? We need to keep that conversation going, and we need to build that friendship in a harmonious way.
Thank you. I think that's a really kind of lovely last thought before we go into our 5-minute break. So I'm going to share my screen here. And I did say a 5-minute break, but I'm going to set a 3-minute timer just because we have lots of things that we want to be able to move by today. So yeah, well, a little sip and stretch break, and we'll be back in 3, not 5 minutes, right?
Thanks.
Starting a timer to keep myself accountable. All right.
Hello, welcome.
Folks. I hope everyone was able to do a little bit of a stretch and a little bit of a sip, because I am very, very, very happy to introduce our next set of speakers for this evening, who are both members of the Aiya Collective. So I would love to invite Lan and Grace. Hi, Grace. Hi, Lan. So Lan holds a Master's in Education degree from the University of Alberta, and she has been working at the university since 2003. While working at Fort Edmonton Park, her first heritage assignment was researching the old Chinese Benevolent Association building for the park. Later years, she sat on the board for the Chinese Benevolent Association and continues to invest her energy and time in promoting Edmonton's Chinatown history and cultural activities. Lan was a founding board member of the Edmonton Heritage Council, and her time there rekindled within her the excitement of heritage work. Being with the Aiya Collective has connected her with like-minded artists and community members who care about Chinatown as much as her. And the Aiya Collective is an intergenerational and multidisciplinary group of artists and Chinatown community members who together are making work that uses art and culture to address the displacement and cultural erasure in Edmonton's Chinatown, dream and to make new futures for their community. So welcome to Lan and Grace. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christina. Okay.
The technical fun part of the evening.
Yes. Well, thank you, Christina, and everyone else who is joining in this talk. And I want to thank the Edmonton Heritage Council for inviting us from the Aiya Collective to participate in ECAMPing during Asian Heritage Month with Shreela and Soni. Aiya is made of a core group of 4 people: Grace, who will be presenting with me, Sean, Wei-Ling, and myself, plus a number of friends who join in when they can. Before I start talking about the 2 Chinatowns, I just want to say that it's a very, very quick overview of the information, because the fact that I don't really have a lot of time to go extensively into it, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. So I just want to start with saying that people often ask me, well, why are you so involved with Chinatown? And I found the words of a fellow Chinatown development activist in San Francisco, Gordon Chen. I found the words that he wrote in his book, Building Community Chinatown Style, answers the question, why am I so involved with Chinatown? And in his book, he wrote, ever since they have existed, Chinatown have been largely misunderstood. While they are often seen by outsiders as just poor neighborhoods or places for cheap food or tourist visits, Chinatowns are dynamic communities that play a key role in economies and in development of thriving cities. I know very well what he's saying, because this is how Edmonton's Chinatown is viewed too, as a place that is old, dirty, and unsafe. I personally, because I lived in Chinatown when I was young and I've come back as a volunteer, I see Chinatown as a dynamic and rich cultural space filled with many untold stories that I'm always itching to capture and tell. The story I want to tell is about the 2 Edmonton Chinatown plans that were developed in 1978 and again in 2017. What led to the development and the end result of one, and possibilities for the other. Chinatown began in 1890. Again, it's a very sweeping history, very simple history of the Chinese community and Chinatown. So Chinatown basically started when the first Chinese arrived in Edmonton in 1890. And from his arrival, businesses started to operate in the place where we know as Canada Place, and that is on the west side of 97th Street and from Jasper Avenue to 101A Avenue. By 1911 and to the 1950s, there were laundries, restaurants, grocery stores, and Chinese societies and association in the first Chinatown, original Chinatown. Several decades later, Edmonton's Chinatown became a skid row. And throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the future of Chinatown was uncertain. The reasons were Chinese families that were living in Chinatown were moving out of Chinatown to better neighborhoods in the city. As well, the slated demolition of the first Chinatown on 97th Street to build Canada Place had forced many Chinese businesses and others that had been operating in that on that block to relocate elsewhere. This motivated several Chinese organizations to form a Safe Chinatown committee in 1973, but it received little community support and disbanded soon after. The Chinese organizations tried again in 1977 by forming the Edmonton Chinatown Planning Committee. It collaborated with the City of Edmonton's Planning Department on a new Chinatown feasibility study with an aim to replace the first Chinatown on the east side of 97th Street, a 4-block area along 102 Avenue and between 95th and 96th Streets. This Chinatown redevelopment plan or master plan or replacement plan, depending on who you talk to, proposed a ceremonial square at the intersection of 96th Street and 102 Avenue and a Chinese arch across 96th Street, just north of Jasper Avenue, as a symbolic entrance to the new or replaced Chinatown.
Dylan,
sorry
to interrupt, but if there's some pictures, we don't see it yet. So let me know if I can help in any way.
No, that's okay, it's coming.
Okay, sorry.
Edmonton City Council approved the Chinatown plan in principle in September 1979. The future Chinatown master plan documented that Chinatown in the Boyle Street area was included as a part of the City of Edmonton's general plan to improve the downtown areas. It was an objective of the larger city's downtown improvement plan to address the social and physical problems in the Boyle Street and Macaulay areas. And it just so happened Chinatown is right in the middle of that. The Chinatown plan itself opined that Chinatown is unique to the City of Edmonton and has the potential to contribute a distinctive character to downtown Edmonton, consistent with the objectives of the general plan. It warned, however, that the present rate and scope of redevelopment is proceeding quickly and threatens to displace a distinctive portion of the Chinese community. The challenge to be addressed is the preservation and enhancement of this community. In 1984, City Council approved several Chinatown projects in the heart of the city's final report. So that the plan was called Heart of the City. They were a Chinese garden, which is now in Louise McKinney Park, a parkade, Chinese arches, and other cultural elements. The Chinese arch was the Hoi Bin Gate, or Chinatown Gate, completed in 1987, and it was a joint effort of the government of Hoi Bin, the City of Edmonton, Alberta government, and the Chinese community. Believing a new replaced Chinatown will happen, the Chinese community came together to start community projects of their own. Unfortunately, this replaced Chinatown, or Chinatown South as it's later called, did not achieve the development potentials of the Chinese community and the city had expected or hoped. The businesses already operating in the replaced Chinatown area and those that were displaced by the construction of Canada Place abandoned Chinatown South to move further north, where a new Chinatown, or Chinatown North, was emerging. While Chinatown North was bustling with shoppers and visitors at that time, Chinatown South exists quietly as a heritage and cultural area. By the 21st century, the city of Edmonton has two Chinatowns, Chinatown South and Chinatown North. It has two gates, one in each Chinatown. A number of events after 2010 occurred that caused much outcry from the Chinese community, business associations, and residents in both Chinatowns that are factors, most likely factors that contribute to a second Chinatown plan. Chinatown South was facing the dismantling of the iconic Huyben Gate, or Chinatown Gate, and the route for the LRT connector line to Millwoods running right along was, the plan was to run it right along 102 Avenue and between 95th Street to 97th Street, which will cut Chinatown South into two parts. The Chinese community tried to move the route off 102 Avenue, but to no avail. Chinatown North has its own challenges with 3 injection sites located within its area and new parking restrictions due to a new ice arena nearby. A second Chinatown plan began in July 2015 as a Chinatown economic plan. The need for an overall integrated Chinatown strategy stems from a city with 2 separate and distinct areas identifying as Chinatown. There was changing growth patterns that made it challenging to maintain 2 Chinatowns, shifting economies and population trends, and increased building and land vacancies. Those are the things that are happening now. The bottom line of the plan is to connect the 2 Chinatowns into one and to make Chinatown viable and sustainable. A company called ECAMP was contracted to consult with City of Edmonton staff and various community stakeholders. The Chinatown Community Economic Development, CCED task force was formed to provide guidance to ECAMP. So there were a number of consultations to community groups and businesses and stakeholders, and I was in on a few of those consultations. The final document entitled the Chinatown Strategy, Energizing a Prosperous Future was completed in June of 2017. It identifies 5 pillars with actions and leads under each pillar. So the first pillar was improve sense of safety and security. That is to strengthen the safety and security in Chinatown, to continue a strong sense of, to contribute to a strong sense of a vibrant and inclusive place. And that the safety and security, are the 2 that constantly come up during the consultations from the stakeholders, community groups, residents that attended those consultations. The second pillar was focused on economic development. So to catalyze an environment for renewed interest and investment in Chinatown. The third pillar was governance and community leadership network. The fourth, celebrate Chinatown as a destination. So to highlight Chinatown as an exciting destination that is treasured by residents and visitors. And the last pillar, enhance built form and landmarks. So to leverage the buildings, landmarks, and streetscapes of Chinatown. Upon the completion of the strategy plan, the CCED task force was replaced by a new group to implement the plan. The new group is called the Chinatown Transformation Collaborative Society, CTC. How the new Chinatown strategy will be carried out, I think will be quite interesting to watch. Particularly with COVID-19 happening now, Chinatown North has been significantly impacted with business closures, temporarily or for good. So when the plan was completed in 2017, COVID-19 wasn't even in the horizon. Why do I care so much about Chinatown? I will answer the question and end my talk by quoting the words of the chair of the 1978 Edmonton Chinatown Planning Committee. He says, why? Because it's part of Edmonton's rich history and must be part of its future. Here are my resources, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Lan. All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Lan. I am going to introduce the other member of the Aiya Collective. So Grace. Grace is a visual artist, a community organizer, and a cultural worker who works in the public realm. She is one of the founding members of Aiya, and since the 2017 removal of the Harbin Gate, she has been compelled to respond to the challenges of a city in flux with public art interventions and social practice. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thanks, Christina. Thanks for inviting Aiya to be part of this. And thank you, Lan, for sharing those 2 development plans for Chinatown. As someone who works in the arts, I think it's an interesting question to ask. What does it mean to say that our city is a museum? I think our city tells stories, and that our public spaces are an important part or an important space in a way to tell our stories. So that's why Aiya exists. We exist because it started because of the removal of the Harbin Gate. The Harbin Gate is Edmonton's Chinatown Gate. And this is me with my pal, the Harbin Gate, when I was 4 years old. My mom made it kind of a tradition for our family to take portraits with the Harbin Gate. And I didn't know why that was important to her until the Harbin Gate was taken away 3 years ago. So the Chinatown community, which I am new to, created a candlelight vigil for the gate when it was torn down on a cold November night. I visited the gate. I visited the site the day after, and just felt like this heavy emptiness. And I recognized that soon I would probably forget this feeling because the visual marker will be gone. So I wondered who felt the same way. I wondered what artists were supposed to do and how we were supposed to respond. So a few of us, including Lan, whom I had the pleasure to meet 3 years ago, and now we're friends, along with Sean and Weiling, were core to this project. And we collected memories and stories of the Harbin Gate. And people learned calligraphy, and they told us their stories and drew it and wrote it on these banners, and we installed it. And a picture of that is here. So this is a really nice photo that Sean took. So our first response to the removal of the gate was kind of a space for mourning, a mourning of something that was really important to our community. And so in mourning, there's different stages, and part of it is, I think, is laughter. So in response, we created this project called the Gentrification Party, which is a satirical way and a satirical poking fun of the system that we are we are confronted with. So in South Chinatown, there's a restaurant called Double Greeting Wonton, which so far that's where all of Aiya's project starts. We brainstormed, this is our meeting, and we brainstormed ideas for the gentrification party. And so this was presented with Nuit Blanche. There was a party, a satirical party. Then we had programming to occupy the space. And to end the night, we invited people to listen to the site. So these are some photos of some of the things. This is the photo booth, and these are Yang Fei Guan's lions. So she was part of the kind of curated party. And I know for some people it was a lot of fun to pretend to be kind of greedy and evil. But I know for some who had to stay in character for the whole night, it was a lot. So these are some photos. And I should acknowledge that there's no talk about gentrification in Chinatown without acknowledging colonialism and the occupation of indigenous land, the idea of terra nullius, the idea that of no one's land, or this land is not used properly, is the philosophy that leads to colonialism, and it's the same philosophy that leads to gentrification. So for our next project, we're honoring the site. We're working with the Edmonton Historical Board to honor the original Harbin Gate site with a ghost site plaque. Often sites are acknowledged as they are, as they exist, but I think it's really interesting to mark the movement of a cultural landmark of movement and displacement, because it tells us who gets to move the borders of a community and who has the power to do that. So Aiya is working with the Edmonton Historical Board, but we're also working with the AGA on expanding the program of this project. And last Tuesday, we had an event. We joined the Coast to Coast Chinatowns Week of Action all across Turtle Island, all across North America. And Aiya joined with two other groups, the Chinese Benevolent Association and the Eat With Me Yeg, and we came up with these ideas to support Chinatown. So if you're interested in supporting Chinatown businesses, or if you want to make a zine about the history and displacement of Edmonton's Chinatown, or you're interested to make friends with some of the Chinese elders in Chinatown, please let us know. We'll love to hear from you. And another thing we're doing is we're creating some love letters to Chinatown, and this is part of something that's happening in New York. It started in New York, and a bunch of cities are part of this. And so it's just a nice, sweet way to let our favorite Chinatown businesses and organizations that we still care for them during this pandemic time. So that's all I have to share, and I'll hand it back to Christina. I don't know, Lan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe do a plug on an upcoming project that Sean and I will be doing, and it's funded by the Edmonton Heritage Council, and it's called it's about Chinatown and people who lived in Chinatown and their memories of the city market. I'm talking about the 97th Street City Market that along 101 101A Avenue, between 101A Avenue and 102nd Avenue, not the GWG building, even though our project will take place in the Edmonton Downtown Farmers Market, that is in GWG. So my plug is I'm looking for, and Sean as well, we're looking for people who are, who have memories, even if their parents or whoever had shopped or have done their Saturday morning grocery shopping in the city market, like buying chicken heads and feet and all those kind of things. We'd love to recruit you for our video project.
Thank you for sharing, Lan. Can folks hear me now? Yeah, I was chatting before and didn't quite realize. So one of the questions that I see lined up in the Q&A is that, are there plans to reinstall the Harbin Gate or to relocate it? And my apologies if that was the question being answered as I was zipping around a little bit.
Grace, you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, and please jump in and fill in. Yes, there are plans to create a new Harbin Gate. It's not at the original location. It's 90 degrees from the original Harbin Gate. So that's really interesting because Chinatown gates traditionally function as gateways into Chinatown. But the new Chinatown gate instead will honor Edmonton's first Chinatown, which is located now on Canada Place, now occupies that first original Chinatown location. So this new gate will function as a memorial to that first Chinatown. And so that act, I think, is really interesting because what does that say to our community as a living museum, from functioning as a gateway to functioning as a memorial? What does that say to our community? Does that say does it say that it's a historical site, or does that say that we're still a living community? Because I see Chinatown as a community that is still living and growing. So that's really interesting. And yeah, Lan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think those are good comments. There was a plan to rebuild a new one because of the location, which is where they wanted to locate it was a lot wider. The street was is a lot wider than the Harbin Gate. So so that's the reason for building a new one. Now, in terms of when that's going to happen, I think it's still in progress. They have with the design included one what they call traditional lion, and then a contemporary lion. So one representing east, which is east, and it will be east facing, and the other will be representing western. It's a western design, so west, and it will be facing westward. So anyway, but the old gate itself, it's now in storage, and we're not quite sure. Some elements of the old gate will be included in the new plan, and that's as far as I know.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to Lan's comment about the idea of having like a authentic Chinese side of the gate and the Western side of the gate. Like why do we need to acknowledge that Western side? This is a Chinatown gate. Why do we always have to repeatedly see ourselves through the white gaze?
And I feel like often when elevating stories and perspectives that have been traditionally excluded from the master narrative of Edmonton, whether that's South Asian stories, Chinese stories, Indigenous stories, such a common response is, but what about this? But what about that? It very much strikes me as the why do we always need to bring up the different perspectives when we're intentionally focusing on perspectives that have been historically excluded? Yeah. We have one more question, and then I'm going to invite Shreela and Soni back on. So if folks kind of have like more holistic questions that they'd like to pose, there's going to be chance for that. So a question for the Aiya Collective. What or where will the love letters to Chinatown be displayed or used?
That's a good idea. This is a very recent idea that just came out maybe a week ago. But I did meet with the group today, and the intent is to mail our letters directly mail them to the Chinatown business that you're writing to, and to like take a photo and maybe hashtag Aiya Collective and love letters to Chinatown. And I know that the WOW community, the community in New York who started this initiative, is collecting a database, and eventually the idea is these artworks are open source and people can print them out, and we can use these creative artworks and send them and mass send them. So you don't have to be an artist to write a love letter to Chinatown. But if you're interested to be part of it, yeah, please, Christina just posted our Facebook site, and please message us and we'll let you know more. We'll create an event eventually too.
All right, one last question. And while we're answering it, Soni and Shreela, why don't you come join us again? Lan, I'm going to direct this question to you because of your connection to Fort Edmonton Park. So the question is, any considerations to place the gate in Fort Edmonton? And I feel like you've kind of addressed it in talking about not knowing what's going to happen with the gate, but what do you feel about that? Do you think that there's a place at Fort Edmonton for the gate, or are there kind of other challenges involved in that?
I mean, it would be great if we can relocate our gate down there. The only thing I think with Fort Edmonton Park is that it's probably because it's so later dated. It was in 1987. It doesn't really fit into their street time period, unless they can find somewhere, you know, off to the side somewhere, which I don't want. If you ask me, it'll be great if we can have it right at the entrance into as soon as you enter into Fort Edmonton Park, close by there. It doesn't have to be, you know, in your face sort of thing, but at least it's obvious. I don't want to be tucked away somewhere. But I know for sure that Fort Edmonton Park Foundation have been talking to the Chinese community in terms of having a structure down there, so a building down there. In one of the conversation we have had is they did say there was on 1905 Street there was a piece of land there. That's in a way, if we wanted, we could build a restaurant down there. So they were looking at a restaurant, and then in the back, a laundry or upstairs on second floor could be a kind of like a museum interpretation center or something like that. But like I said, they have talked to us about it. We have looked at it. We have considered it. But the thing is that the thing is, you know, who's going to fund it? Where are you going to get the money to fund that? It wasn't cheap. Even the concept plan, I think they proposed to us was like $50,000. So, and I know that we can apply for grants for that, but the thing is, it's what do you agree on 1905? We don't have everybody on board as in terms of what they like to see down there. Some people feel that having a laundry down there kind of degrades the Chinese. You know, a restaurant is probably better, but it just, but it's just looking at what they want to do. And I kind of got off tangent, and you just asked me about the gate. I don't, it is possibility, but I don't think the time when it was built would fit into the park.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have another question about the gate. So this is from Colette. It's a really random question, but on the Northern Clairview LRT line, the train passes by a dismantled gate sitting in a parking lot. And for a long time, Colette thought this was the Harbin Gate, but a coworker of theirs told her that it was there for many, many years. Does anyone happen to know more about this gate and why it's there?
Which one? Where is it? Sorry.
In a parking lot north of the Clairview LRT line. A dismantled gate sitting in a parking lot.
If it's the gate that's if you pass the Coliseum station, if that's the gate Colette is talking about, that is the original Harbin Gate.
That's the, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the original Harbin Gate is stored in the outdoor yard.
Yeah.
And people have told me, like, people who were neutral, people in the Chinese community who are neutral about the removal of the gate, but when they see that site, that makes them really mad. It feels it's quite a visceral experience.
Yeah.
To see that.
And
Yeah.
especially if we think about the objects that we've kept from other communities in Edmonton, those are in the archives, those are in managed, protected, climate controlled conditions. So yeah, I empathize with that. That would hurt to ride past that and see that.
Yeah, and I do agree with Grace that the Chinese community, many of them are not very happy with the treatment of the gate. So
there isn't any talks about it going into Fort Edmonton Park.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, we can look at it. If Fort Edmonton Park will allow us to put it down there, that would be great. But then it's looking, then again, it's looking at the cost of putting it back up together again. It's when they were bringing it down, it's they try to be as careful as possible, but some of the tiles and all that, you can't save those. So it will need to be repaired before you can put it back up.
So I have a question coming from Facebook, and it's hopping back to you, Shreela. So what would you say to people who think that they're too young to donate their materials to the archives? Do you need to be real old to do something like that?
No, you just have to be done with the records. So as long as you're, as long as you have the photograph, or you're appreciating it, it's still part of your life, keep it. It's only when you're done with things that you put it into cold storage. So it's not about being too young, but you should, to archive things means to take a part of your experience and then put it into long-term memory storage. But you have to be finished with it first. Until then, don't part with your memories until you're ready.
But don't throw things away without checking with the archives first or the museum first to see if it's something that should be saved or archived.
Like in talking with archivists, I learned that they're really interested in not finished works, but works in progress. So anybody who writes diaries you know, as a kid or writes journals, keep all of those, and those become important records of our lives lived, thoughts thunked. and the archives would be interested in collecting that information.
So when I was interim grants coordinator last year at Edmonton Heritage Council, we ran a pilot mentorship program. And one of the mentors was actually Marlena Wyman, who is the former historian laureate of the city of Edmonton. And on her final closing ceremony, she actually suggested that there be a formal archivist program that Edmonton Heritage could support to sort of support what Shreela is saying as well, right? Because I think that as people are looking at how do we document and create space for voices less heard, stories not documented, there needs to be like a, how do you do this, step 1, step 2, step 3, because a lot of people don't know, right? So I appreciate the question about being young or being old, or where do you go? Because a lot of people have no idea. And I really value that Shreela put together the South Asian Origins Facebook page and has done all this work, because a lot of that has also inspired looking into Edmonton as part of what are those hidden stories that we don't know about, right? From all communities, including South Asian, Chinese.
Well, another tip is in anything you have, you can put a little bookmark or something that says, you know, this object should go into the archives if you ever find it. And then you can forget about it, and then if anybody ever sees it, they'll remember to deliver it to the archives.
A message for the future from the past, so that in the future we remember our past. Yeah. We have one more question that from the Q&A that we're going to address, and since we're getting closer to 9 o'clock, I think it's in best interest for all if we wrap it up. And this question, I think, can maybe have a bit more of a robust answer, but let's try to be brief, but to be truthful and answer. So how does one tell the story of Edmonton's Asian origins that attracts and rallies more Edmontonians regardless of their origins? How does one make stories more compelling in order to appeal to Edmontonians to prioritize heritage preservation? And the question is from Bin Lao. Yeah, Soni.
So education, education, education. I really strongly believe that Edmonton Public School Board needs to step up and gather all of these different stories of all communities, including Asian, and put it in the curriculum. Because that's one point of getting all Edmontonians involved at a very early age to be excited about their heritage history. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, that seed, that relevancy seed needs to be planted early on. Yeah, Grace.
I just want to say that labor to put on ethnic minorities to make their histories entertaining that's something I resist, and that's something I want Chinatowns to resist, because Chinatowns are meant for the people who live there, people who speak the language, and to turn it to cater to entertainment means my culture is not for other people's entertainment. So that's something I want to resist.
Yeah, I think there's, sorry, Shreela.
I would like to just say that, however, stories can be entertaining, and people can be entertaining. So within the authentic place, historical places and environments, there is room to engage people in an entertaining way.
I agree, but how do I resist Disneyfying like a story or a place? Like, it has its own right to exist without without the cater again to the white gaze or the dominant gaze.
And like to your comments, Grace, it's similar to kind of the call or what I was expressing in the treaty acknowledgement. There's the work that folks outside of that story need to do. So the work, that emotional labor, shouldn't have to always be on you folks. It shouldn't be on you folks. White folks got to do that work to be educated. And I think there's different avenues for relevancy. You know, the history of Chinatown is relevant because that is your community, or because that is the neighborhood that you, as somebody else, that's the neighborhood that you walk through. But it can be relevant through an interesting story, but they're two different things. I kind of lost my thought halfway through, I'll admit that.
Thank you, Christina, for saying that. I think it's about caring about each other, right? And taking an interest for each other, like for someone's different lived experience. And to Shreela's point, like there needs to be more storytellers and artists in my community, in our communities. Like I know there's history of my parents wanting me to be a professional rather than an artist because there's security in that. So I think it's time for us to encourage and raise up our own creative storytellers. So that's our job too.
So I'd like to pose kind of one last question inspired by what you said, Grace. Within kind of the Edmonton world and kind of the world that I live in, there's often talk about the division between the arts and between heritage. Is that even possible? Because I perceive them as the same thing. So what do you folks think about that?
Can I answer that? I'm with you, Christina, that it's the same thing. I remember when I was working at Forrington Park, and I was doing building history. So the reconstruction of the buildings down in the park, buildings that no longer exist. And to me, I mean, even when I'm looking at the blueprint drawings and creating those buildings, it's heritage work, but it's also artistic work at the same time. So that's what's fascinating me with the blend of the two. I don't call myself an artist, but at the same time, but I think art comes in different forms. But when I watch somebody who can render a drawing, a blueprint of a building that no longer was there, but based on, and that was my experience, based on a couple of photographs, we were able to recreate that. And then not only recreate that, we also had to fill it with objects. And then you have to kind of search for those objects. But most of all, I find that we have to tell the story. And to me, that's the artistic side comes through then. It's telling that story of that building and who who lived there and all that, and how you do it. It's not just factual stuff, but you have to spin it. So it's almost like spinning a story when you're going through that.
Thank you, Lan. Soni, did you have something you wanted to add?
I think that I agree with Lan very much, but unfortunately, what has happened again, I'm coming back to the legislation and policy and funding framework of Canada and Edmonton, right? So it's been segregated according to a context of policy that defines heritage and a context of policy that defines art. Like, I feel like this is one of the trajectories that has created that separation and the divide, when really they shouldn't be separated, right? So, and also this links back to that piece that I started the presentation with. Asian history is everybody's history. Indigenous history is everybody's history. Black history is everybody's history. Whatever minority history we're talking about, because we are minority communities as defined by the Canadian government, needs to be not understood as that. But unfortunately, we have to make space for that because that voice is not taking precedence, right? So this is the quagmire dilemma that we're constantly having to negotiate when we talk about separating and then coming together, or coming together and separating, right? So there's like a parallel piece going on. So the last piece that Shreela and I said about the next way forward. So it's about naming exclusion. Then it's about recognizing how that exclusion is causing these barriers to funding, to policy, to hearing the right stories, to melding art and heritage together, and then looking at that constructively and creating opportunities for true inclusion, right? Like I can have a diversity and multicultural plan, that's so great, but if I'm not including everybody, what's the point, right? It's just that song and dance. Hey, I'm wearing my bikini and I have this samosa, right? But you're not including me in decisions that are so important for political, social, and cultural, like, placemaking, right? That's it, I'm done.
Yeah. We need to make sure that all of the beautiful talk that we do about the society that we want, we need to back that up with action. And the action is on folks like me. All right, we need to step up. We need to educate ourselves. We need to be there when it's not easy, because we have the privilege for it to be easy. So please step up, learn about the stories around you, talk about the stories that surround you, share this event with the folks around you. It will be publicly available on the ECAMP website in time, because yeah, I think many Edmontonians have a lot to learn and to take away from all of you tonight. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's 9 o'clock, so like I think we should probably wrap it up. But thank you so much to Grace and Chan-Marples from the Aiya Collective for sharing your hearts and your minds. Thank you so much to Soni and Shreela for being here. Big thanks to Elise right there for helping me out on the back end. And thank you all who are participating here. Thank you so much for signing up. Please keep track of what Aiya is doing, and the Alberta Sikh Heritage Project, and Shreela's Facebook for Punjabi Pioneers. Reach out to Soni to talk to her about all of the awesome things that she's doing. And yeah, remember to, yeah. Does anyone have like a final thought?
Thank you, Christina. This was a great event.
I wasn't fishing, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Christina, for being such a wonderful host and creating that space for us.
And I think also the space for like the whole idea of camping out and sitting around the campfire together sharing stories is a great way to tool around our city and learn about who we are for each other.
Yeah. If you want to learn more about the stories that fill our city, please follow the Edmonton City as Museum Project on Facebook. We will have monthly ECAMPing trips that you can stay a part of. And I just encourage you to look for the stories that surround you in the city. The stories that are in park names, the stories that are on the faded buildings, the stories of the people who live in your neighborhood. The more that we can learn from each other and listen and take truthful action, the better we all will be for it. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. All of the speakers, Elise, everyone in the background, I really appreciate you being out here for the first ECAMPing trip. All right.
Thank you, Christina.
All right, I'll ask the panelists to stick around, but attendees, have a good night.